Part 1: The Birth of Fear, Silent Shadows, and Early Horrors. In this video, we take a deep dive into the history of horror cinema, exploring its evolution from the early days of silent films to the modern iterations we know today. We delve into iconic films, the cultural impact of the genre, and its development, revealing how horror continues to terrify and captivate audiences. Long before the blood-curdling screams and jump scares of modern horror, the genre was born in eerie silence. The earliest horror films emerged in the late 19th and early 20th centuries during the silent film era when filmmakers used shadows, expressionistic imagery, and haunting soundtracks played live in theaters to stir the audience's imagination. These films didn't rely on spoken dialogue. They didn't need to. The fear came from what was seen and sometimes what wasn't. One of the very first horror films, Le Manoir du Diable, 1896, by Georges Méliès, lasted just over 3 minutes, but it introduced key elements that would define the genre: bats, phantoms, and the devil himself. Méliès, a magician turned filmmaker, understood that cinema was the perfect tool for illusion, and horror thrived in that mystery. Soon after, German Expressionism took horror to darker, more psychological places. Films like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, 1920, and Nosferatu, 1922, weren't just about monsters. They reflected post-war anxiety and societal fears. With twisted sets, high contrast lighting, and distorted perspectives, these films made viewers feel like they were trapped inside a waking nightmare. The absence of sound made every flicker of movement and every widening eye more intense. These early horror stories didn't just entertain, they mirrored the unease of a changing world. Technology was advancing, wars had shaken humanity, and cities were growing fast. Fear of the unknown, both supernatural and societal, found its perfect expression on screen. The silent era laid the foundation for everything that would follow. Horror was no longer just folklore. It had a new home in cinema, and even without a single word spoken, it had already started to leave its mark on our deepest fears. Part 2: Monsters, Madness, and the Golden Age of Hollywood. As sound entered cinema in the late 1920s, horror found its voice, and it howled. The 1930s and 1940s marked the golden age of Hollywood horror, a time when classic monsters walked among us, forever etching their names and faces into film history. With the birth of the talkies, the genre evolved dramatically, adding eerie musical scores, chilling screams, and whispered threats that now echoed in the minds of viewers. Universal Pictures became the undisputed home of horror, giving the world a string of unforgettable creatures. Dracula 1931, starring Bela Lugosi, was among the first to bring the gothic vampire to life with an unsettling elegance. Lugosi's thick accent, piercing gaze, and commanding presence turned Count Dracula into an icon. Just a few months later, Boris Karloff terrified audiences as the misunderstood monster in Frankenstein, 1931, a film that asked, who is the real monster, the creature, or his creator? The success of these films led to a wave of sequels and spin-offs: The Mummy, 1932, The Invisible Man, 1933, Bride of Frankenstein, 1935, each exploring not just physical horror, but the psychological fears of identity, death, and isolation. These monsters weren't just terrifying, they were tragic. They reflected human flaws, fears of science gone too far, and the eternal struggle between man and nature. Even during World War II, horror remained a powerful outlet. Audiences, already facing real world horrors, still flocked to see tales of werewolves, mad scientists, and cursed souls. The genre had found its rhythm, mixing fantasy with reality, entertainment with existential dread. This era turned horror into more than just a niche. It became a cornerstone of cinematic storytelling. The Golden Age didn't just give us monsters, it gave us metaphors, and in doing so, elevated horror from cheap thrills to cultural commentary. Part 3, Shadows of Reality, the post war shift, and psychological terror. As the world emerged from the shadows of World War II, horror cinema began to change. The real life atrocities of war had left deep psychological scars, and filmmakers started turning the lens inward, away from Gothic castles and toward the human mind. The monsters became less supernatural and more human. The terror was no longer only in the fangs of vampires or the stitches of Frankenstein's creature. It now lived in everyday people, in neighbors, in ourselves. In the late 1940s and into the 1950s, horror merged with noir and thriller elements, birthing a new subgenre that explored paranoia, repression, and identity. Films like Cat People, 1942, and The Body Snatcher, 1945, leaned into mood, tension, and the idea that the scariest things might be those we can't see. Horror began whispering instead of screaming, and that whisper often sounded uncomfortably familiar. But it wasn't just psychological fear creeping in, science fiction was too. As the Cold War dawned, films started reflecting new anxieties: nuclear war, alien invasion, and scientific experimentation gone wrong. The Thing from Another World, 1951, and Invasion of the Body Snatchers, 1956, weren't just about creatures from beyond. They were metaphors for the fear of communism, conformity, and the loss of identity in a rapidly modernizing world. These films mirrored a society in flux, caught between post war hope and Cold War dread. Science, once a source of wonder, was now a double edged sword. The lab coat replaced the wizard's cloak, and the horrors of the past gave way to future fears. The horror genre was evolving, growing smarter, darker, and more reflective of real world tensions. It was no longer just about being afraid of the dark, it was about what the darkness revealed about us. Part 4, Blood, Guts, and Rebellion, the horror renaissance of the 1960s and 70s. By the 1960s, horror cinema had broken free from the restraints of tradition. The world was changing fast: civil rights protests, the Vietnam War, political assassinations, and the horror genre responded with a raw, rebellious energy. Filmmakers no longer tiptoed around violence or taboos. Instead, they confronted them head on, ripping open the screen and spilling society's fears in full bloody color. It began with Psycho, 1960. Alfred Hitchcock's black and white masterpiece redefined horror overnight. With its shocking plot twists, psychological depth, and infamous shower scene, Psycho blurred the line between horror and reality. Norman Bates wasn't a supernatural monster, he was someone you might pass on the street. That made him even scarier. Then came Night of the Living Dead, 1968, a low budget indie film that changed everything. Directed by George A. Romero, it introduced the modern zombie, but its real horror was buried in subtext. The film touched on racism, war, and social breakdown. Its ending, haunting and abrupt, felt like a gut punch. Horror was no longer just escapism, it was protest. The 1970s pushed boundaries even further. Films like The Exorcist, 1973, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974, and Halloween, 1978, didn't just scare, they shocked. These stories dealt with religious dread, cannibalism, serial killers, and the fragility of suburban safety. Blood flowed freely, screams felt real. Audiences weren't just entertained, they were disturbed. This era also marked the rise of the final girl trope. The idea of a lone female survivor who endures the horror while others fall. Characters like Laurie Strode in Halloween became symbols of strength and survival, adding a new layer of complexity to the genre. The 60s and 70s proved that horror could be raw, political, and deeply personal. It became a mirror held up to a chaotic world, and what it showed us was terrifyingly real. Part 5: Slashes, Stereotypes, and the birth of the horror franchise. The 1980s boom. If the 1970s cracked open the doors of terror, the 1980s kicked them wide open and then ran screaming through them with a chainsaw in one hand and a VHS tape in the other. This was the era when horror went mainstream, loud and unapologetically bloody. It was a golden age for gore, but also the beginning of something bigger: the rise of the horror franchise. The slasher craze took center stage. Following the success of Halloween, a wave of masked killers and unlucky teenagers filled the screens. Friday the 13th, 1980, introduced Jason Voorhees and his infamous hockey mask. A Nightmare on Elm Street, 1984, gave us Freddy Krueger, a wisecracking killer who haunted dreams with a glove of blades. These films were brutal, suspenseful, and oddly formulaic, but audiences couldn't get enough. The villains became pop culture icons, and the sequels kept rolling in. But it wasn't just about body counts. Horror in the 80s tapped into youth culture, suburban fears, and even consumerism. Teenagers were the main targets and the main audience. The genre danced on the line between cautionary tales and cathartic fantasies. Sleep with your boyfriend, die, do drugs, die, but survive the night. And maybe, just maybe, you walk away stronger. At the same time, practical effects reached new levels. Visionary artists like Tom Savini and Rick Baker turned blood and guts into gruesome works of art. Films like The Thing, 1982, and Hellraiser, 1987, pushed the limits of what audiences could stomach, and they did it without CGI. Home video also changed everything. Horror thrived on VHS, where smaller, riskier films could find a cult following. Evil Dead, 1981, for example, became a hit not in theaters, but in living rooms and dorm rooms. Horror was no longer limited to late night showings. It was now part of everyday entertainment. The 1980s made horror bold, brash, and marketable. It was fun, it was scary, and it was everywhere. But beneath the surface of all the screaming and slashing, horror was evolving, ready to reinvent itself again in the decade to come. Part 6: Meta, Monsters, and Reinvention, the 1990s Revival. By the early 1990s, horror was starting to feel predictable. After a decade of sequels, slasher fatigue had set in. Audiences had seen it all: masked killers, final girls, endless reboots, and they weren't scared anymore. The genre needed a reset. What it got instead was something smarter: horror that was self aware, self referential, and not afraid to laugh at itself while still delivering genuine scares. Enter Scream, 1996. Directed by Wes Craven, ironically the same mind behind A Nightmare on Elm Street, Scream breathed new life into the genre by turning its cliches into commentary. Its characters had seen horror movies, they knew the rules. Don't say, "I'll be right back." Don't run upstairs. And definitely don't answer the phone when a creepy voice asks, "What's your favorite scary movie?" It was clever, bloody, and fresh, and it worked. Scream wasn't just a hit, it was a reset button. This decade also saw horror diversifying. It wasn't all slashers and jump scares. Psychological horror returned with films like The Sixth Sense, 1999, which used atmosphere and suspense rather than gore. Its now famous twist ending shocked audiences and proved that horror could still surprise. Meanwhile, new monsters emerged from outside Hollywood. In Japan, filmmakers like Hideo Nakata redefined supernatural horror with Ringu 1998, a chilling tale of a cursed videotape that would soon inspire America's The Ring and kick off a wave of J horror remakes. These films focused more on creeping dread and tragic spirits than bloodshed, offering a fresh flavor of fear. The 90s also gave rise to horror hybrids, movies that blended horror with other genres. From Dusk Till Dawn, 1996, mixed crime with vampires. Event Horizon, 1997, fused sci fi with demonic possession. Horror was experimenting again, stretching its boundaries and preparing for the digital age just around the corner. In short, the 1990s proved horror didn't have to die to be reborn. All it needed was a mirror and the guts to look at itself. Part 7, Found Footage and Fear, redefined. Horror in the 2000s. As the world stepped into the 2000s, horror took another dramatic turn. The digital age had arrived, and with it came a new kind of terror, one that felt more real than ever before. Low budget, handheld, and deliberately rough around the edges, found footage horror exploded onto the scene and made audiences question whether what they were watching was fiction or something more disturbing. It began with The Blair Witch Project, 1999, a film so convincing in its marketing that many believed it was an actual documentary. Shot on a shoestring budget with unknown actors, it turned shaky cam and eerie forests into tools of pure dread. The film's success proved a critical point. Horror didn't need a huge budget to be terrifying, it just needed to feel real. The 2000s saw a flood of found footage horror films, including Paranormal Activity 2007, which used a static home security camera to slowly build tension night after night. Its minimalism worked brilliantly, turning whispers, creaks, and shadows into pure nightmare fuel. The film's massive box office success reignited the genre, spawning a franchise and inspiring a wave of imitators. Meanwhile, overseas horror continued to thrive. Japanese and Korean films like Ju-on, The Grudge, and A Tale of Two Sisters gained international attention, leading to a surge of remakes in Hollywood. These films leaned into ghost stories and emotional trauma, delivering slow burn scares that left lasting impressions. But not all horror in the 2000s was subtle. This was also the era of torture porn, a controversial subgenre known for graphic violence and moral ambiguity. Films like Saw 2004 and Hostel 2005 shocked audiences with their gruesome traps and ethical dilemmas. Were these films exploitative? Maybe. But they also tapped into post 9/11 anxieties, fear of captivity, and a growing distrust in systems meant to protect us. Horror in the 2000s was raw, restless, and constantly evolving. It thrived in a world of uncertainty, where cameras were everywhere, information was instant, and fear could spread as fast as a viral video. This decade didn't just redefine horror, it reconnected it to its most primal form, the fear that what you're watching might actually be real. Part 8, Prestige, Diversity, and the Future of Fear, Horror. Today and beyond today, horror stands taller than ever, no longer dismissed as just pulp entertainment, but praised as one of the most daring and dynamic genres in cinema. The 2000s and 20s ushered in a new wave of horror that's smarter, more inclusive, and deeply rooted in real world trauma. The monsters are still here, yes, but now they come wrapped in symbolism, style, and sharp social commentary. This modern renaissance is often called elevated horror, films that blend art house aesthetics with deeply unsettling stories. Directors like Jordan Peele redefined what horror could say. Get Out 2017 tackled racism through a psychological thriller lens, terrifying audiences not just with its twisty plot, but with the uncomfortable truths it revealed. It won an Academy Award for Best Original Screenplay, something once unthinkable for a horror film. Ari Aster's Hereditary 2018 and Midsommar 2019 pushed boundaries even further, focusing on grief, cults, and family trauma. These films were slow, disturbing, and deeply emotional. Robert Eggers brought historical dread to life with The Witch 2015 and The Lighthouse 2019, proving that mood, language, and period detail could be just as terrifying as any jump scare. Meanwhile, horror also became more global and diverse. Films like Train to Busan, South Korea, His House, UK, and Tigers Are Not Afraid, Mexico, introduced fresh voices and perspectives, often grounded in local folklore, societal issues, and regional fears. These stories reminded us that fear is universal, but how we experience it can be deeply personal. Streaming platforms have also changed the game. Horror content is more accessible than ever, allowing indie creators to reach massive audiences overnight. Shows like The Haunting of Hill House and Midnight Mass proved that horror could thrive in long form storytelling too, offering both scares and depth. And where is horror headed next? Into new frontiers, VR, AE, interactive stories, and even horror experiences powered by real time biofeedback. But no matter how the medium changes, the core of horror remains the same. It reflects us, our fears, our flaws, our future. From silent shadows to socially conscious nightmares, horror has always adapted. It never dies, it just waits patiently in the dark, ready to scare us all over again.